right? First of all, Moses approaches Pharaoh and says to him, or I should say, God approaches Moses and tells him to tell Pharaoh that Israel is my firstborn. Let my son go, that he may worship me. And if you refuse to let him go, I will slay your firstborn. So really, is Israel God's firstborn? Or is he at least God's literal firstborn? So if you look through the book of Genesis and Bereshit, Noah gives birth to 3 children, and those 3 children give birth to 70 children, which become the 70 root nations of the world. Now, it doesn't mean there are 70 countries. There are 70 nations, root nations, and they, snowball into more countries than that. But there are 70 nations which were already determined way before Abraham comes onto the scene. Abraham comes onto the scene, gives birth to Ishmael. Ishmaelites become their own nation as well. Esau become their own nation. Israel is the youngest of the nations. How on earth is it that God's calling Israel his firstborn? So how do we reconcile God's statement to Moses to call Israel his firstborn? So this theme of Bechor and first is actually very pervasive in Jewish law as well. So I'm just going to go through a few of them just so that you're aware of them. For example, you have a mitzvah. If you have sheep and you're shearing their wool off their selves, to provide wool and make things out of them. So the first shearings go to the Kohen priest. Mitzvah number 1. And these are just off the top of my head. When I was preparing this, I didn't do this in any depth, so there might be more than what I'm going to show you. Reshit arisotechem, which is the mitzvah of challah, which we're all well aware of. So if you have a certain quantity of dough while baking challah, so you designate a certain portion also to the Kohen priest. In the olden days, when everybody was ritually pure, the Kohen priests would eat it. Now that we're all not pure, it's all just burnt. But that's another mitzvah of Reshit. Reshit arisotechem. Reshit bikurei admatecha. So if someone had a farm in Israel and they had growing on that farm the 7 species of that were unique to Israel, so that's wheat, barley, pomegranates, grapes, olives, dates, and figs. So the first of those fruits to grow, they would tie a red ribbon around them to mark them and be able to differentiate them across all other fruits that start growing after that. And when they're ready to bring them to the temple, they take them off the trees, obviously, put them in a basket, and they go to the temple with that, to the house of God. And there are certain rituals that they would perform, right? Not the focus of today. However, whatever is recited in that ritual actually is mentioned in the Haggadah. So that's another mitzvah referred to as firsts, the first of the fruits. Then you have the firsts of your children. So any firstborn male child that is the exit of the womb, within 30 days, that male child has to be redeemed from the Kohen priest. And so what happens is the father takes 5 silver coins, passes them to the Kohen, and the Kohen gives him back his child. If anybody recognizes, this picture is actually from the stained glass windows in the Keilah Center. Quite nice. And it's actually for the tribe of Reuven, because Reuven was the firstborn, so that was the symbolism in that design. But that's what it's representing. This mitzvah of giving over your son, or exchanging the coins for your son, because the son is designated to God on account of being the first of the womb. And then you have the first of your kosher flock. So if you have cows and sheep and goats, so the firstborn male clean beast, like the sheep you see here, has to be brought to the temple as a sacrifice. So it was designated for the altar, and its blood was sprinkled on the altar, and its fat was burnt, and the flesh was given to the Kohen priests to eat it with sanctity, like they would any other sacrifice. And then you have a firstborn male donkey. Now, the firstborn male donkey was designated for also for the Kohen, but in a little bit of a different way. The way that the donkey worked was that instead of giving the donkey over to you couldn't give it to the altar because it was an impure animal. And instead of giving the donkey to the Kohen as is, instead you give him a lamb and you keep your first male donkey. And that's the way it worked. And if you did not give over that make that exchange, in other words, you did not give over a lamb in exchange to keep your donkey, then that donkey was beheaded, and that's what you're left with. Now, I assure you, the opposite side of the picture is a lot worse than what you see right here. And if it's evoked a bothersome reaction from you, I think it was meant to, not by me, but by the one who commanded it. Because when Hashem gives over this command, he says, when your children ask, what is this that you're doing? I want you to tell them the story of the Exodus. So just to be clear, in a few nights, we're going to have the Passover Seder. The Passover Seder is a mitzvah from the Torah to tell over the story of the Exodus to our children. The Torah talks about telling over that story in 4 different ways. And because of the ways that the Torah tells that command over, the sages derive from that there's 4 different types of children that you'd have to tell this to. And by the way that it speaks about it, you can figure out what type of child you got to tell the story over to. And based on that child's, intelligence or where he is at in his life, you have to communicate that story in a different way. So in one instance, the Torah talks about a child that asks you in very detailed ways, tell me the story of Egypt, and tell me the laws, and tell me everything. So by the way that he's asking, you know that he's an intelligent child, and you tell over that child, or you deal with him the way he is because he's intelligent, and he'll go with it. You have another child that will ask you in a very dismissive way, showing that he's not that interested, and you have a way to tell over that child as well. And then you have a child that's not so intellectually with it, it's not so highly intelligent, and therefore every day he just takes things as they are. So in order to prompt a reaction from him, you have this bizarre commandment of the beheading of the donkey. Suddenly it evokes a reaction from him. He suddenly wakes up, gets interested in asking, and when you get that question out of him, you can now set him on the road to Jewish education. So I believe that solving the mystery of the firstborn and the theme in the Torah is wrapped up in the laws related to the donkey, which are introduced in this section of the Torah. So I just want to expand out this section just for a moment, because I found that after 26 years of reading this every day, at least once a day, and in some instances twice a day, I realized the following. The whole section of this part of the Torah starts off as follows. Yeah? And God spoke to Moses, saying, consecrate for me every firstborn, man and beast, the first issue of every womb among the Israelites. I want them all designated to me. That's what God says to Moses in one line. Moses turns around after hearing that, turns to the nation of Israel, and look at the next line. He says to the people, remember this day on which you went free from Egypt, the house of bondage, how the Lord freed you from it with a mighty hand, and on this day no leavened bread shall be eaten. That's what Moses has to say. He ignores totally the idea of the firstborn, and he starts talking about Passover. And not only that, he gets into other stuff. So what does he speak about? He speaks about Passover, how Passover has to fall in the spring. He reminds us that God took us out with a strong hand. He tells us that we should not eat leavened bread. He tells us that when we arrive to Canaan, we have a bunch of things that we have to perform. Keep 7 days of Passover. Eat matzah. Don't eat chametz. You should tell over the story to the children. And you shall have a sign on your arm and your head, which are known as tefillin. And he gives us that commandment as well. And then finally, he gets into the mitzvah of the Bechor. And when he does get into the mitzvah of Bechor, then he gets into a little bit of the details, such as the following that you see here. Yeah, that all firstborn animals that emit from the womb are designated in one way or another. So it's male animals only, no female animals. Donkeys are to be redeemed, but they're done as an exchange with lambs. Unredeemed donkeys are to be beheaded, and male children are to be redeemed as well by way of that transaction I mentioned to you before. So only after Moses goes through all these things, then finally he gets to the idea of the firstborns, and then he ends it off again with what you see here. And he says the following: it was with a mighty hand that Hashem brought us out of Egypt, the house of bondage. And when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, Hashem slew the firstborn in the land of Egypt, the firstborn of both man and beast. And therefore I sacrifice to the Lord every first male issue of the womb, but redeem every firstborn among my sons. And so it shall be as a sign upon your hand and as a symbol on your forehead, that with a mighty hand the Lord freed us from Egypt. So he ends off with this mitzvah of tefillin now. So it's very bizarre that in the actual instance that God speaks about the firstborn and the mitzvah of the firstborn, Moses mixes it up with Passover, mixes it up with bread and matzah, mixes it up with the mitzvah of tefillin, mixes it up with the land of Israel. There's all these things that are just mixed into it, like some buffet that looks kind of random. So I'd like to take us on through a bit of a journey that might put some sense into all of this. And if anybody, by the way, has any questions, or if there are any cracks in anything that I'm saying, feel free to ask them. Just chat them down. I'll try to address them. And if there's anything that might take me off topic, I'll just address it after the main focus of tonight. Because as I'm putting this together, so much keeps creeping in that I have to actually spend most of my time keeping things out just to keep the focus. But so much keeps snowballing after these things come together, and it's quite amazing. So we'll go into the main story, number 1, Cain and Abel. The story is, as you all know, Cain initiates a sacrifice to God, but he brings over, as you all know, grain. And on the other hand, Abel sees what Cain does, brings over the same his sacrifice to God, which are animals, puts them on the altar, and Cain sees that Hashem accepts Abel's or Hevel's sacrifice, but doesn't accept his own. He gets angry about this, and as you all know, Cain slays Abel. Abel dies, and then God tells Cain, "What is it that you did?" So here's an interesting thing. The Perkei Rabbi Eliezer says this story as follows. He says that the story that of the Cain and Abel story was actually precipitated by Adam. And the story goes that Adam encouraged his sons on the day of Passover, or what would be the day of Passover, which was the beginning of the spring months. And he said to them, on this day, God will bring out his people from bondage. Why don't you bring sacrifices on? And they will bring sacrifices to God. Why don't you bring a sacrifice to God on this day? And so in the Perkei Rabbi Eliezer, it says that Cain and Abel go to Mount Moriah. Cain brings a offering of barley, not flax, like the other midrash says, and Abel brings a sacrifice of sheep. Now, you know the continuation of the story. So one thing I just want to point out, how does the Perkei Rabbi Eliezer know that it's barley and not flax? So where is he drawing it out from? So one thing to point out, Cain is the innovator of offerings to God. He actually brought the first offering. And the Torah uses the word mincha when he brings it. Now there's no record in the temple of any offering that's brought of flax. However, there is a mincha that's brought of barley. So one such offering was brought during the Omer festival between Pesach and Shavuot. And the Omer of barley was the first fruit to be readied in the land of Israel. Obviously, when viewed from the perspective that the world was created in Nisan, so therefore it's the first fruit of the year, or barley would be the first fruit of the year. So Cain, being the firstborn of civilization, would easily correlate with the first fruit of the seasons. And there's another reference to a mincha of barley brought forth by a sota, which is the wayward wife. And that one is known as a minchat kenaot, a jealousy offering. So perhaps there's no coincidence that the Tractate of Menachot starts off with this as its first Mishnah, and I have a very, very big thing when it comes to first Mishnahs. And it could be perhaps that Perkei Rabbi Eliezer draws out from there that the offering was actually barley and not flax, like the Tanchuma would say. And on top of that, he was our first instance of jealousy as well among people. So that's just one thing to point out. Now Cain kills Abel, and when he does, God asks him the famous question, Cain, where's your brother? And he says back, am I my brother's keeper? And then God, tells him, the blood of your brothers is screaming out from the earth. And so he wants to punish Cain. And then Cain does some sort of quasi teshuva, repentance, when he's being chastised by God. And God says to him, you know what? I won't kill you, but you're going to have to wander the earth. And then Cain says back to him, but when I wander the earth, those who see me will kill me. So God says back to him, then I'll give you a sign to protect you. Now, the classic opinion is that the sign that God gave Cain was a sign that went on his head. But the Pirkei Eliezer says that the sign that he gave him was actually on his arm. Now, isn't that interesting? If you take the perspective of the story of Pirkei Eliezer, of the Cain and Abel story, you see actually all the elements that Moses was talking about in that section of Firstborns are all come together. You have Cain and Abel bringing the sacrifice on Har Moriah, which is in Israel, Kanan. You have him bringing a barley offering. You have Abel bringing a goat or a lamb or whatever it might be. You have also this intersection of the phylacteries, the tefillin, the sign on the arm and the sign on the head. They're all coming together in this story. What doesn't appear here is the donkey. So I want to suggest that perhaps let's attribute one of these characters as a donkey or representative of the donkey, and one of these characters as representative of the sheep. So it'll be quite obvious who's the sheep here, because Hevel brings a sheep. So we have to leave ourselves with Cain being the donkey. So let's keep that thought in the back of our heads just for a moment. And then you'll see all these parallels from the first section of the Torah that we spoke about with firstborns and Cain and Abel. Okay? So you've got the strong hand I'll get to at another instance. You've got the first fruit offering, because Cain brings that first fruit being barley, right? The offering is taking place in Israel. It's on Passover. You have also the point that barley is what matzah and chametz is made from, and the signs, which are the tefillin. Okay, let's go to our next story in Genesis, and that's the story of Isaac and Ishmael. Now, there's no mention of the word Bechor by these two characters, although it's clear that Ishmael is the firstborn of his mother, Hagar, and Yitzhak is the firstborn of his mother, Sarah. So they're both the exit of the womb. Now, here's a few things that make Ishmael an obvious donkey. One, there's actually a verse later on in the prophets where God is chastising Israel, and he's chastising them because of their reliance on Egypt. And he says to them that the Egyptians have their flesh, the flesh of donkeys. So that's what he says about the Egyptians of those days. And by the way, the Egyptians of those days are not the Egyptians of these days. So let's not worry about political correctness. And if you are worried about political correctness, I'll address that after this, because I just want to keep the focus. So just either private message me or just stay on after, and we can address that. But you see here that the Egyptians of those days were representative of the donkey. And therefore, Ishmael, coming from a mother who's part of that nation, is the issue of a donkey. He's the firstborn of the donkey, let's say, and then he represents a donkey. Furthermore, you actually have instances where the angel reveals to Hagar, his mother, on a certain instance, that he'll be a very successful man, but he'll be a wild ass of a man, a peri adam, and therefore this wild ass of a man is actually a donkey, because that's what the peri adam indicates. There was one more instance. One more instance, which is when they're going to the famous binding of Isaac. Abraham takes Isaac, and he takes two other people with him. The Midrash fills in the information as to who those other two were, and they say that it was Ishmael and Eliezer. And when he gets to a certain mountaintop and he sees in the distance Har Moriah, he asks Isaac, "What do you see?" And Isaac says, "I see the Shekhinah there." And the other two say, "We see nothing." So he says to the two, which are Ishmael and Eliezer, "Shvu lachem po im hachamor." Stay here with the chamor. And the sages add, "Am hadome lechamor," a nation that is likened to a donkey. So you see, on three counts, Ishmael is representative of a donkey, and Eliezer also, for that matter. Yitzchak, on the other hand, is representative of the Seh, because he's taking the place of a holy sacrifice, and only a Seh, a lamb, can go on the Mizbeach. And just by the way, when Isaac notices that there is no lamb, the Chida points out, he asks his father, "Abba, ayeh hasileolah, where is the Seh for the offering?" And the Chida points out that the word ayeh, Aleph Yod Hey, is Ani Yitzchak Haseh. I, Isaac, I am the Seh. So to this, the father responds, "Yeah, God will see to his lamb for the burnt offering, my son." Right? And the rabbis also punctuate that to say, Elokim yir'elo haseh le'olah beni. Who's going to the olah? My son. So Yitzchak is clearly the lamb in this story. Now you all know the story that Abraham, in the end, does not sacrifice Isaac. He only binds Isaac. So let's keep this image in our minds. Abraham is binding Isaac. And I want to just give you a quick introduction and not spend too much time on it, but a quick introduction on the 10 expressions of God. They're known as Sefirot. Now, this is what's called Kabbalah, but it's a basic Kabbalah. Every Sephardic person has it in their siddur. Most Sephardic siddurim have it. So it's a basic Kabbalah that we're allowed to talk about. And these are 10 what are known as inner expressions of God. Now, we know that there are 10 sayings of God. There are 10 commandments of God. So these are 10 inner expressions. These aren't something you can actually point the finger to or actually see. There's something that are more conceptual or spiritual in nature. It's not something you can actually point to. But these 10 inner expressions underlie all of reality, according to the inner teachings of Torah. And they obviously have their correspondence. So there's nothing that exists in this world that is not made up of these 10 inner Sefirot, these 10 inner expressions of God, or these 10 divine expressions. And so, just to put two quick examples in perspective, when you apply these 10 inner expressions to the body of man, they all indicate different parts of the person. So, for example, Keter Chochmah and Binah occupy these three upper sefirot, these three upper expressions occupy the head area, whereas the 7 lower ones occupy the body. And therefore, Chesed and Gvura, which are kindness and discipline, are the right and left arm. Tiferet is the torso. Netzach, Chod, Yesod are the 2 legs and the reproductive organ. And Malchut is outside of itself and mirrors the entire structure, which is someone's spouse. But we'll leave that one out. I just want to focus on the aspects of Chesed and Gvura, which are right-handed and left-handedness. Another example, just by the way, of how these 10 expressions underlie all of reality, you can see it also, for example, in society. For example, government would represent the upper 3 ones, whether you like it or the government or not, is a different story. But the government, which overlooks the entire society, would occupy the upper 3, and the laborers and the average person would occupy the bottom 7, and each person would represent, or group of people would represent certain ones, for example. But that's another indication. Another one, for example, is time. These divine expressions can be expressed also in time. So you have let's say 6,000 years of human history. So the first 1,000 years represent Chesed, the second 1,000 represent Gvura, or you have the 6 days of creation. Again, the first one represents Chesed, the second one Gvura, third one Tiferet, Netzach, Chod, Yesod, 4th, 5th, and 6th day. So they just keep repeating themselves all over reality. and how you dissect them for these different aspects of reality is a different discussion. But I just want to point out this Chesed and Gvura, which each have their aspect also in the Jewish nation itself. In other words, the Jewish nation itself also is made up of these inner expressions of God, and Abraham is represented by Chesed, or Chesed is represented by Abraham, I should say, and Gvura, discipline, is represented by Yitzchak. Abraham was always out there giving, and Yitzchak, who wanted to do, had to always constantly hold back. That's why you don't know much about Yitzchak, but you know a lot about Abraham. So if Yitzchak represents the left hand and Abraham represents the right hand, as you see in this diagram, then what exactly does that look like? That looks like tefillin. And therefore, this act of tefillin is exactly what's being played out in the story of the binding of Isaac. And with the story of Isaac and Ishmael, the entire parallel appears again. So you have this family living in the land of Canaan, Israel. You have the birth of Yitzhak, which took place on Nisan, by the way. You have these two Bechors, Yitzhak and Ishmael, each one corresponding to either a lamb or a donkey. You have a ram offering. You have the event happening on Har Moriah, by the way. And then you have this parallel of tefillin, Yitzhak representing Gvura, the left arm, and Abraham representing Chesed, the right arm. And then three expressions of donkey for Ishmael. So again, all these things are coming together in the story of Isaac and Ishmael. I want to take you through one more story. Actually, a few more, but here's where things really, really get interesting. Jacob and Esau. Now, we all know the story that they were born as twins. And on one fateful day, Esau comes in exhausted, wanting to eat, and Yaakov's cooking a stew. So he takes from Yaakov the stew and asks him to pour it down his throat. And Yaakov says to him, you know what, I'll give it to you, but sell me your birthright. So only a chamor would sell his birthright. And so Esau sells his birthright to Yaakov. Yaakov takes the birthright, gives him the stew and bread and whatever else he asked for, and a deal is made. Okay, so clearly Esau was the firstborn in this story. He's the Bechor, yeah, and the Torah says, by the way, that this event took place at the death of Abraham. And the Talmud teaches us that the Avot, the patriarchs of the Jewish people, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were either born on Pesach or they were born on Rosh Hashanah. So Abraham was one of the ones that were born on Pesach. And if he was born on Pesach, the Talmud continues to teach us that he actually died on Pesach as well. And therefore, the day that this exchange takes place is on Pesach. And that's when everything happens. Now, when this exchange takes place, Esau selling the birthright, he articulates exactly why he doesn't have an interest in the birthright, because he despises it. He does not have any interest in pursuing the responsibilities that spirituality brings with it. Instead, he has more interest in this world, and therefore he gives Yaakov this birthright, and he's more interested in the trappings of this world. Then the time comes that Isaac tells to Esau, it's time to give you a blessing. Now, Isaac never knew about this exchange, but his mother, Rivka, did know about this exchange. So when Isaac tells Esau, I want to give you this blessing, fetch for me some game, bring it to me, and when you bring it to me, I'll give you this blessing. So in hearing this, Rebekah commands Jacob to bring Isaac a meal while impersonating Esau, in order to receive the power of blessing. So Jacob puts on goat skin, in order to simulate what it feels like to have hairy arms like Esau. And in doing so, he deceives his father in order to receive that blessing, which is the power of blessing itself. And once again, the day that this takes place, according to our tradition, is Passover, right? And the meats that he brings them are two goats, one representing the Pesach offering, one representing the Chagiga offering. So Yaakov gets the blessing from his father. He exits the room having received what he came for, and then Esau enters the room and requests the bracha from his father. And upon discovering that Yaakov had taken it, he resolves in his heart to hate Jacob and envy him until the day that Yitzhak dies, at which point he'll kill Jacob. So Yaakov runs away to the house of his uncle Lavan, and there he becomes a shepherd of sheep for 21 years. Now, it's not a far stretch to see that in becoming a master shepherd of sheep for 21 years, and after donning a bunch of goat skins, that Yaakov is representative of the Seh. So now I want to point something out, that when Isaac and Ishmael bury their father Abraham, the Torah says that that Abraham passes away and he was buried by Yitzhak and Ishmael, his sons. And by the Torah putting them in that order, it indicates that Ishmael acknowledged Yitzhak's primacy as firstborn, and because of that tiny mention in the Torah, the sages deduce from there that Ishmael did teshuvah in the end. However, when Yitzhak passes away, Esav is mentioned first, indicating that Esav really never gave Yaakov that acknowledgement of being the firstborn. And the story gets even worse, which is this, that when Yaakov passes away, Esav is standing at the gates of Machpelah, not allowing him to be buried. In other words, Esav does not accept the exchange. And what happens to a donkey when you don't accept the exchange? So the Midrash tells us that he demands to see the deed for the exchange. One of the brothers of the tribes runs to Egypt with super speed to fetch the deed, and in the meantime, one of the children of the Shvatim, known as Hushim, who was deaf, didn't know what was going on because he couldn't hear. All he can see is that his uncle Esav, or great uncle, is blocking his grandfather from being buried. His grandfather's casket sitting on the floor in an indignant manner, and the uncles are arguing with him. So he pulls out his sword and he decapitates Esav, and the head of Esav rolls into the cave, and the body falls on the spot. Esav, my friends, is the chamor that didn't accept the exchange. Okay, and there we have it. You have, in the parallel of these three stories now, Jacob and Esav again. They're living in the land of Canaan. The events occur on Passover. Esav is the hands, because when the father blesses Yaakov, he says, I feel the hands of Esav, but the voice is Yaakov. So Esav represents the hands. Yaakov represents the head, where the voice comes from. You have Esav, clearly the donkey, right? The donkey that doesn't accept the exchange. And Yaakov, clearly the lamb. You have an exchange here, right? Or an exchange that's supposed to take place. And in light of the fact that it doesn't take place, you have the decapitation of Esav as the donkey. So it's clear what the symbols are here. Now, at this point, we can probably form a picture of what it is a firstborn is supposed to be. So let's imagine, a couple that give birth to their first child. That first child is the focus of all their love, all their attention, all the good things that parents have to give to their children. That first child is the recipient of all of that, right? Until you get a second child. And when that second child comes along, you got to divide it between the two. And when that first child sees that, right, he gets a little bit jealous. So what is it exactly that the firstborn is supposed to do? So here's the picture I want to paint for you. The role of the firstborn, and I've written it down here. In an average home, when parents have to struggle to survive, the firstborn becomes a bridge between the subsequent children and their parents to help the parents with their work and transmit the values of the parents to the younger children. So because of the help of the firstborn, the younger children are the ones that are afforded a better education and set up for a better life in the long run. And therefore, to be that firstborn needs to totally submit himself to the benefit of others at the risk of not being left with anything for himself. How does that translate in the case of Israel? Israel is that conduit for blessing. Right? It has to be that firstborn. It has to transmit the values of the supreme being, right? That spiritual being that nobody can relate to, and transmit that to the rest of the world, which we've been doing successfully. And when we're not, we are the punching bag of the world. And as you can see from the stories of Cain, Ishmael, Esau, the expectations resting on the first are very heavy, and they resulted in this breakdown, right? Which you see reached a crescendo when it comes to Esau. And the symbolism of Esau's head being severed is indicative of the awareness of Esau and people in general of what our moral and ethical responsibilities are, but lacking the willpower to carry it through. Because Esau knew, his head knew what his body had to do. He just couldn't get it to do it. And therefore the head rolls into the cave of Machpelah, where the holy patriarchs are buried, but the body did not make it there. The firstborn has it the hardest when it comes to opportunities that are in bloom for the younger siblings, especially if it is at the expense of the firstborn. And it is perhaps for this reason that the Torah gifts the Bechor with a double inheritance, right? He lacks the tools now because the younger ones get the better education, to get the better positions, to get the better spouses. Now they can marry aristocracy because they ended up becoming a doctor or something else like that. Yeah, it was all at the expense of the firstborn. So the firstborn has a tough role. Now, I do want to point out that this issue of the firstborn, this challenge that the firstborn seem to experience, the woman, the females among the firstborns, right, like Leah, or the elder daughter of Lot, which calls her a Bechira, which calls her a firstborn as well, they didn't seem to have these issues. So perhaps there's nothing to fix. There's no tikkun to make, so to speak. Now, this all takes a turn when it comes to the children of Jacob. For the first time, someone seems to accept their role to some degree, not fully, but to some degree, in the story of Reuben and Joseph. Now, it boggles my mind, and I don't understand what he did or why he did it, and how he could have gotten involved with his stepmother's couch, and why Bilhah, his stepmother, would even allow it. The whole story is beyond me. It's one of these puzzles I can't get over. And I sometimes wonder if it was simply that Reuben was not all there. But then I came across this passage in the Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer that says that he was perfect. He was good looking, he was strong, he was smart, he had all the qualities of a leader. And so it's even more perplexing. So Samson Raphael Hirsch suggests that when Rachel died, Jacob became withdrawn, and Reuben felt the need to take on this paternal role, and he overstepped his authority, which resulted in the mixing up of his father's couch, and that cost him the firstborn. However, he somehow redeemed himself when he accepted the exchange. Joseph was the lamb, right? The brothers wanted to kill him, right? So they were going to almost not accept an exchange. And he says, no, don't kill him. Put him in a pit. And he had the intention to take him back, but he fell short of taking him back to his father. And while he's in this pit, he gets sold. And that's debatable as to how. But he gets sold. Reuben comes back to this pit, finds his brother missing, and he spends the rest of his life going through such self-inflicted torture over what happened to Joseph. He feels responsible for it because he's the older brother, and he's gone. And you can tell even later on in life when he's experiencing problems in Egypt, this is forefront in his mind. His brother's not so much, but this is forefront in his mind. So you can see how he tortured himself on account of Joseph's disappearance. Right? So his brothers at that point take the coat of Joseph, dip it in the goat's blood, so he's the lamb. And Joseph is the donkey. And Reuben is the donkey. And if there's any doubt about that, let me introduce you to this gematria. This numerical value of Reuben's name is Ha-Chamor, the donkey. It's not even just Chamor, which is 254, but Ha-Chamor, He-Ha-Yedi'ah, the definitive article, right? Reuben is the donkey, and Joseph represents the lamb, which he has a name. His name is actually 156, but the Torah does add a hey to his name, equaling 161. And 161 times 2 is keves, which also means lamb. And perhaps it's justified to give him 161 times 2 because as someone who in the end receives the Bechor, he gets a double portion. And also, in getting that blessing of the double portion, his two sons actually become full-fledged tribes. And therefore, Joseph is expressed with this number 2, right? And therefore, 2 times 161 is keves. Ultimately, however, the end result is that these brothers band together, they learn to reconcile, they form the beautiful tapestry and mosaic of brothers that is the nation of Israel, which is the Jewish people. But you still don't have the perfect model of a firstborn yet, because Reuven did fall short. But you do have it with these two, Ephraim and Manasseh. The two aspects of Joseph in perfect action. Joseph was able to cross the chasm of self-nullification like no other person before him. He ignored the temptations of his master's wife. He was able to look past the crimes committed against him, and he supported his brothers without any grudge or any hatred. He fulfilled the role of the younger brother and the older brother simultaneously and merited two sons that epitomized this negation of self. So the sages teach us that Ephraim was the more intelligent one. Manasseh accepted his role as the helper to his father, while Ephraim spent his time learning with his grandfather, Jacob. And the Netziv points out that when they received the blessing from Jacob, the right hand represented spiritual superiority of Ephraim, which went on Ephraim's head, but Manasseh was sitting on the right leg, which represented the material and financial superiority of Manasseh. And these two brothers represented the perfect models of brotherhood. With them, with them, you now have a mold for the Jewish people to follow. And now we can understand the role and responsibility of brothers and firstborns on an individual level. And now that we have this mold on the individual level, we can now bring it to the national level. But before we go there, I just want to point out, I don't want to dwell on this, but I do want to point out that the Torah never speaks of the 5 books of Moses never speak of spiritual entities to the degree that we speak of it in Talmudic literature or certainly not in esoteric literature. But this idea of Hamor and lamb, they're represented in Talmudic literature and in Musar literature as the Yetzer Tov and the Yetzer Ra. The Yetzer Ra is the donkey, right? The one that's attracted to the earth. And the lamb is the Yetzer Tov. The Yetzer Ra, compared to the Yetzer Tov, is the firstborn. The younger brother is the Yetzer Tov. The Yetzer Ra is the older brother. Yeah, the Yetzer Ra simply cannot fathom how giving up something physical can yield more blessing and reward. But if he can give it up of himself to cross that threshold, cross the chasm of doubt and take a leap of faith, then you can enjoy the blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob like Joseph did. The Torah apparently doesn't speak in spiritual concepts, right? To say Yetzer Tov and Yetzer Ra. So you have this concept of donkey and lamb, which manifest these ideas. And now, how is Israel Reshit if it's the youngest of nations? Because there's a concept of Sof Ma'aseh B'Machshavat Techila, that the ultimate action was in the mind first. And actually, when the rabbis teach Bereshit bara Elokim et Hashemayim v'ha'aretz, that God created the world, in the beginning God created heaven and the earth. So this word Bereshit, they don't translate in one aspect of understanding it. They explain Bereshit as with Reshit in mind. And who is Reshit? Israel. And Egypt is symbolized by the symbol of Chomer, material, the donkey. There's also no coincidence that the forefather of Egypt was Ham, who was reported to have had relations with his wife on the ark when it was forbidden. And therefore Egypt and many of Ham's descendants are associated with a strong connection to earthiness. Israel, on the other hand, is symbolized by the sheep. Its lineage is from Isaac and Jacob. All that we have spoken of with respect to the Bechor also applies to all of Israel as a whole. When Jacob bought the birthright from Esau and later received the blessings of the firstborn from his father Isaac, he and his children became the recipients of this special energy of bracha that flows through the Bechor. So from Israel, who is the firstborn of the nations, this flow of blessing emanates and is spread out to the entire world. When Moses approaches Pharaoh in God's name, he demands that Pharaoh let Israel, his firstborn, go. Yeah, he's essentially telling him, you have to let him go because everyone depends on this. He's warning him. He's in essence telling him that you need to accept the exchange. Otherwise, Egypt will be decapitated with the death of their firstborns, because God wants his lamb. He wants the lamb of the nations. He wants it given over to him in exchange for the well-being of the donkey. And if the exchange is not made, well then, he gets decapitated. Now, we know the story. The Jews come out of Mitzrayim, they're redeemed. Now, before Moses goes straight to the point, he reviews the essential elements that involve dedication to God and the tools to enable dedication. The exodus from Egypt justifies the sanctification of the firstborn. The eating of the matzah and the eradication of chametz and seor, which is leaven and yeast, from our homes is equivalent to the eradication of our yetzer hara, our evil inclination. Right? So matzah and bread are exactly the same in content, and were it not for the difference caused by yeast, the yeast which causes leaven and causes the dough to rise, and it transforms it from a lowly matzah to an arrogant, puffy loaf of bread. The yeast is therefore symbolic of our arrogance, rooted in our evil inclination, because it puffs up the reality, creating an illusion that the dough is bigger than what it's supposed to be. And therefore Moses commands us on a national level to observe the Passover festival. Eradicate chametz, eat matzah, and which is symbolic of the yetzer tov. Eradicate the yetzer hara and apply your yetzer tov. So these contents are similar, and their names are also similar. Chametz and matzah are very similar, with the exception of a little bridge in the chet, the hay to its roof, right? So it's a perfect parallel between these ideas of eradicating the yetzer hara and applying your yetzer tov. Tefillin have the same symbolism. Yeah, Moses commands the Bnei Israel to bind the sign of the tefillin on their arms and their heads to constantly be aware of God's presence. The symbolism on the arm and head are to remind us that God is ever vigilant, involved in our world, that he has taken out the Jewish people from Egypt with a mighty hand. So we take the teachings of the Torah, which are understood by our head, and we actualize them by performing good deeds and obeying the commandments through the positive commandments. In the case of the hand that is bound by tefillin, we bind the hand from transgressing a negative precept. And by the way, we also put the left hand before we bind the hand before we put the head, which is also reminiscent of Na'aseh v'nishma, that we will do first and then we will listen, because doing will help us, enable us to understand better. Right? But you see this same symbolism of raining down on that aspect that is attracted to the physical world, right? By binding the left hand, just like Isaac was bound, right? He held back from doing things that he wanted to do, that anybody wants to do when they come to this world. So that same symbolism plays out here. Now I want to make a note of the strong hand. So we understand the strong hand to be that God took us out with a mighty hand, against the force of the Egyptians. But the Seforno, one of the commentaries of the Torah, he interprets it in a different way. He says that the strong hand was the strong hand of Egypt. In other words, that God took us out in a state of strong hand. Whose strong hand? The hand of Egypt. Yes, Egypt was stubborn, and stubbornness in Hebrew is called orif, which is paro backwards. And in Pharaoh refusing to let the Israelites go, he was being stubborn. So therefore Moses commands Israel to wear tefillin and spiritually sensitize our heads and our hands to observe God's commandments and let him into our lives on a personal level, not just a national level. finally, once we have these tools to enable us to better dedicate our lives to God, can we sanctify ourselves appropriately and worthy of the title and duties of the firstborn? Without some training and dedicating to God, we are more prone to failure, as illustrated by the Torah and the stories of Cain and Abel, Ishmael and Isaac, and Esav and Yaakov. So with these concepts of Passover, matzah and bread, tefillin on the binding of the left hand by the right hand and on the head, all these concepts are coming together to form a picture of, you want to be a Bechor, you have responsibilities. Now, there's another significance that arose recently that I realized literally in the last day or two, which is the significance of the land of Canaan. Rabbi Yaakov Abuchatzera brings down in one of his books, Pituchei Chotam, he gives all the nations a certain symbolism based on their name, and he indicates that there's a certain negative spiritual power or negative spiritual influence that is very, very potent in the land of Israel, which was formerly called Canaan, through the nations that were there. So, for example, in the first part of Moses' discussion about the firstborn, he talks about it being the land of the Hittites, and Rabbi Yaakov Chasser calls the Hittites representative of Chemda and Ta'ava, lust and desire, right? It's the land of the Emori, which is where you get the word mumar, which is exchange, where someone who is eager to exchange something that doesn't belong to him for something that belongs to him of lesser value. Chivi. The Chivi was another tribe of people. Chivi actually literally is translated into Aramaic as serpent, the evil serpent. There's this idea of intense spiritual forces there, negative forces there in Canaan, that in order to subdue them, you have to just submit yourself, which is what the word Kanan means. So the spiritual energy of Bechor can only be tapped and mastered through complete submission, hachna'ah, from the word Kanan, and dedication to God. So Israel is the land of the Bechor, and if you want to be able to receive the bracha, you need to submit and dedicate your life to God. Then the land will be given to you, tanalach, like it says. This actually might clarify what the whole point of slavery was in the Torah. Slavery according to the Torah was not, today it's not a politically correct thing that you can look positively on. People want to erase the history of slavery, but I think that's not necessary. I think people should be proud of their history and use it as a springboard to improve. I mean, we're not living in a messianic age yet, so there's what to work on, and that's what we have history for, to learn from it. Anyway, slavery, according to the Torah, was a program to cultivate the mind and behavior of a less refined person. Whether it was done correctly or not is a different discussion, but clearly, if you look at the Torah's laws and that of the sages, slavery was a rehabilitation program, because when slaves were freed, they were full-fledged citizens. Yeah, so the Torah's prescription of turning an Esav into Jacob was living with him and spending a few years assisting him. Then he turned him into an Israelite. I mean, that's the whole idea of Tikkun Olam. Just that the program that the Torah recommended back in its day was one where you actually lived with the person, and you did it by serving him. So that person was probably more refined, so he was the head of the relationship, and the person who occupied the labor was obviously the body in the relationship. But what happened? That person who was the slave, so to speak, saw how the master behaved, and was supposed to use that to eventually become a master himself, because when he was freed, he became a full-fledged Israelite. And as a matter of fact, the way that prophets became prophets is that they served the prophet. The student prophets would serve as a slave the master prophet. That's how they became master prophets themselves. Now, why does Moses get into a discussion about Pesach, Matzah, Chametz, and Tefillin? Because the challenge of the Bechor is too overwhelming to confront head on. And therefore, we need to train our spiritual muscles and apply physical behavior to be worthy of it. Now, why is the chamor the only non-kosher animal to merit a pidyon? And what is it with this barbaric rule that demands that it must be beheaded if it is not redeemed? So the chamor is symbolic of our impermanent material aspects. The ascendancy to the soul level is inevitable. We're not going to be here forever. The donkey, if you look at the way it behaves, is a refined, impure animal that can be totally elevated if we want it to be. It just needs to let go. But the donkey is very happy being on this earth, enjoying from this earth. It's actually a refined and pure animal. It's not like a lion or a crocodile, right? It's actually a pretty decent animal. Yeah, so it represents the Jew that just wants to be left alone. The average Jew, the average normal, healthy Jew just wants to be left alone. Yeah, we say it in our tikva. Yeah, liot am chofshi be'artzenu. We just want to be left alone. We just want to be free in our land. We just want to be left alone. But there's another reality out there, which is the spiritual reality. And God wants us to connect to that because that's the permanent one, right? So he wants us to aspire spiritually. But if we don't aspire spiritually, right, we're not cut out for the spiritual life, then there's something that we can do to still connect us, which is to dedicate something to the spiritual world or to a spiritual person or to a sage or to an institution, a synagogue or anything like that. Dedicate some talent to God or some contribution, whether or financial contribution or whatever it might be. You don't have to necessarily be cut out for if you're not cut out for the spiritual life, you don't have to dedicate to the spiritual life, but connect to it in some which way. And you find actually this expression in the following. I'm not one for gematrias, but if you take these three expressions, Elokei Avraham, the God of Abraham, Elokei Yitzchak, the God of Yitzchak, and Elokei Yaakov, the God of Yaakov. So Avraham is on the right side, representing giving of yourself, elevating yourself to God. So the numerical value of Elokei Avraham is 305, which is Se. It's actually Elokei Avraham plus its letters, plus the 9 letters in Hebrew. Elokei Yitzchak is exactly 254, which is Chamor on the left-hand side, right? Which is someone who's not necessarily cut out for this for spiritual things. And then in the middle, a combination of both, right, is Elokei Yaakov, which is exactly the gematria, exactly the numerical value of the word Bechor, 228. So there is an outlet for those who are not cut out for either a dedicated life of the Seh or the mixed life of the Bechor. If someone is very attracted to the material world, he can create a relationship with someone who is dedicated to godliness, and he can achieve balance through that relationship. When we do, we will be able to achieve the greatness and bracha that comes with this balance and be worthy of miracles once again. I want everybody to have a Chodesh Tov and a meaningful Passover this year. I hope you gained somewhat from this. Any questions you have, feel free to stick around or message me after. Thank you for attending.